Norway, 2020. Part 1. The Rebellion That Led to Darkness. Jacob stood by the window, staring out into the chilly evening, his reflection distorted by the frosted glass. The house was quiet, but inside him, a storm raged. At just 19 years old, he was already exhausted by life, though not in the way most people would expect. He wasn't overwhelmed by responsibilities or expectations from school or work. No, it was something far deeper, a restlessness, a yearning for something he couldn't quite name, but sought in all the wrong places. Jacob had always been different from the rest of his family. His parents, Marcus and Ingrid, were devout Christians who dedicated their lives to their faith. They had raised Jacob and his younger sister, Elise, in a home where prayer, church, and scripture were woven into the fabric of their daily lives. But from a young age, Jacob had resisted. Where his parents saw comfort and salvation in their faith, Jacob saw only restriction, rules and boundaries that suffocated him. He craved freedom, adventure, something that couldn't be contained by the teachings of the Bible or the expectations of his family. As he grew older, his rebellion became more pronounced. He stopped attending church, much to his parents' heartbreak, and surrounded himself with friends who shared his disdain for authority. To Jacob, life was meant to be lived on his own terms, without the suffocating grip of religion. He wanted to taste everything the world had to offer, and his newfound circle of friends offered him just that: nights of drinking, drugs, and reckless behavior that made him feel invincible, even as it slowly hollowed him out. The home where Jacob now stood had once felt warm and welcoming, a place of refuge. The wooden beams, the soft hum of the heater in the background, the scent of freshly baked bread from Ingrid's kitchen, all of it was familiar. But lately, it felt more like a cage, a constant reminder of what he was trying to escape. The air inside felt stifling, as though the walls themselves were judging him, whispering about his failures and the path he had chosen. Jacob's eyes drifted to the framed photograph on the mantel. It was from years ago, a family vacation to the fjords. In the picture, a younger Jacob stood beside his father, both of them grinning ear to ear as they cast fishing lines into the calm waters. Back then, things had been simple, but as the years passed, that simplicity had faded, replaced by bitterness and a growing distance between him and his parents. Ingrid, his mother, walked into the room, her eyes soft but heavy with concern. She had always been the heart of the family, her faith the foundation on which everything was built. But in recent months, she had been walking on eggshells around Jacob, unsure of how to reach him. "Jacob," she said gently, her voice almost pleading, "won't you join us for dinner tonight? It's been days since we've sat together as a family." He didn't even turn to look at her, his jaw clenched, and his hands balled into fists in his pockets. "I'm not hungry," he muttered, his voice thick with irritation. "Please," she continued, stepping closer. "We're worried about you. This isn't you, Jacob. You've changed so much." "I've changed?" Jacob snapped, finally turning to face her. His eyes, once filled with warmth, were now cold, distant. "Maybe this is who I've always been. Maybe you just never wanted to see it." Ingrid's face crumpled, but she stood her ground. This isn't the real you. I know you're struggling, but turning away from us, from God, isn't the answer." "God." Jacob spat the word as though it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "What has he ever done for me? I'm done with your prayers and your sermons. I don't need them. I don't need him." The words cut deep, and Ingrid's heart shattered a little more. But she wasn't ready to give up on her son, not yet. "You think this is freedom, don't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "But you're not free, Jacob. You're a prisoner to all these things you think will fill the emptiness inside you." Jacob's face twisted with anger. "You don't understand anything," he growled before storming out of the room, slamming the front door behind him with such force that the walls seemed to shake. Outside, the cold Norwegian night greeted him, but he barely felt it. He was too consumed by his own fury. How could they not see? How could they not understand that all he wanted was to live his life without the constant burden of their expectations and religious guilt? He didn't need their God. He didn't need anyone. He climbed into his car, the leather seat cold against his skin. The engine roared to life as he sped away from the house, the city lights of Oslo blurring in his vision. He knew exactly where he was headed. Another party, another night of forgetting. It had become routine at this point. The drugs, the alcohol, the loud music drowning out everything else. Tonight was no different. The party was already in full swing by the time Jacob arrived. The heavy bass of the music reverberated through the floors, and the air was thick with the pungent smell of marijuana. People he barely knew greeted him with half-hearted waves and slurred words. He didn't care. All that mattered was finding that next hit, that next escape. A girl with bright red hair passed him a small pill, grinning. "This one's strong," she said, her eyes glazed over. "You'll feel like you're floating." Jacob didn't hesitate. He swallowed the pill without a second thought, chasing it down with a gulp of whiskey. For a few hours, it worked. The world became a blur, and all the pain, all the frustration, melted away. He danced, laughed, and let himself forget. But as the night wore on, something shifted. The high wasn't the same this time. It wasn't the carefree euphoria he had come to expect. Instead, there was a weight pressing down on him, a darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. The music became distorted, the laughter around him sinister. He could feel eyes on him, watching, waiting. His heart raced, and his breathing became shallow. Something was wrong. He stumbled outside, desperate for air. The cold night hit him like a slap to the face, but it didn't clear his mind. The whispers started then, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. He spun around, but there was no one there. "Stop it," he muttered, pressing his hands to his ears. But the whispers persisted, swirling around him, taunting him. By the time he got back into his car, the world felt like it was spinning out of control. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and bending in ways that didn't make sense. He could still hear the whispers, clearer now, their words sharp and cruel. "You're worthless. They'll never love you. You can't escape us." Jacob's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He didn't know where he was driving, only that he had to get away. Away from the party, away from the voices, away from everything. But no matter how fast he drove, the darkness followed. By the time he arrived back at his family's home, it was well past midnight. The house was dark, his parents and sister long since asleep. Jacob stumbled inside, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind a swirling mess of confusion and fear. He made his way to his bedroom, collapsing onto the bed, hoping for sleep to take him. But as his eyes closed, the whispers grew louder. And for the first time in his life, Jacob felt truly afraid. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. Part 2. Whispers of Darkness. The room was suffocatingly silent. Jacob lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the lingering effects of the drugs and alcohol. His body was exhausted, but his mind was wide awake, buzzing with a disorienting mix of confusion and fear. The clock on his nightstand ticked loudly in the stillness of the night, each second dragging into the next. Yet time seemed irrelevant as Jacob wrestled with the growing unease that had wrapped itself around him. His bedroom, once a safe space filled with memories of childhood and laughter, now felt foreign. The posters on the wall seemed to shift in the dim light, their edges blurring in his peripheral vision. His reflection in the mirror across the room looked distorted, the outline of his body stretching unnaturally, as though something else had taken residence in the space where he used to feel at home. He tried to dismiss it all as just the aftermath of a wild night. Bad drugs mixed with too much whiskey, or maybe exhaustion from days of not sleeping properly. But deep down, Jacob knew it was more than that. The night at the party had left a mark on him, something that wasn't fading with the sunrise. In fact, as the night grew darker, the shadows in his room seemed to stretch further, their fingers curling toward him, and the air grew colder, oppressive. Then came the voices again, soft at first, like the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, barely discernible. They whispered just beneath the surface of his thoughts, but the words were unclear. Jacob squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block them out. His heart raced, and a bead of sweat trickled down his forehead, despite the freezing temperature of the room. "Focus. It's all in your head," he told himself, his voice shaking. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices overlapping in a language he didn't understand. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. The voices seemed to be inside him now, crawling through his mind, filling every corner of his thoughts. Suddenly, the whispers sharpened, their words clear as knives. "You don't belong here. They'll never forgive you. You're lost." Jacob's eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might explode out of his chest. The room was freezing now, far colder than it should have been in the middle of summer. His breath came out in shallow, visible puffs, the air misting in front of him like he was outside on a winter's night. Something was in the room with him. Jacob felt it before he saw it. A dark presence, heavy and malevolent, creeping through the shadows like a predator stalking its prey. He scanned the room, his vision blurry and his pulse quickening. In the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of something moving. Just a flicker, but enough to send a jolt of terror down his spine. The shadows seemed to gather in one spot near the foot of his bed, pooling together, swirling and taking form. A cold sweat broke out across Jacob's skin as he watched, frozen in fear, unable to look away. His throat tightened, and his hands gripped the sheets so tightly his knuckles turned white. He tried to move, to scream, to run, but it was as if his body had betrayed him, paralyzed under the weight of the darkness that now filled the room. The whispers returned, louder now, almost mocking. "You'll never be free. You belong to us." A figure began to emerge from the swirling darkness, vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Its features were indistinct, shifting and morphing like smoke, yet its presence was unmistakably evil. Jacob could feel the hatred radiating from it, thick and suffocating, pressing down on his chest like an iron weight. The figure didn't speak, but its presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Jacob had never felt anything like it before. He had always scoffed at his parents' talk of spiritual warfare and demons. But now he wasn't so sure. As the figure crept closer, Jacob's breath hitched. His body, still frozen in place, trembled as a strange sensation washed over him, like something was trying to take hold of him, to claim him. His mind screamed for him to move, to do something, but all he could do was watch in horror as the figure stretched out a hand toward him, its fingers long and twisted, more shadow than flesh. In that moment, Jacob realized the truth. This was no bad trip. This wasn't just the drugs. Whatever was happening to him was real, terrifyingly, inescapably real. And it wanted him. Suddenly, the room began to spin. The walls seemed to close in, and the figure before him multiplied, twisting and contorting as if feeding on his fear. Jacob gasped for air, his lungs burning as though he were drowning. The whispers grew to a deafening roar inside his mind, and he felt like his very soul was being pulled apart, stretched to its breaking point. "You're mine." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, deep, guttural, and filled with a terrifying authority. Jacob's body convulsed, his back arching off the bed as the darkness engulfed him. His vision blurred, and his head throbbed as if it might split open. Pain shot through his limbs, his muscles tightening, his skin burning. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the overpowering presence that had claimed him. Then, in the midst of the chaos, came a faint light. It started as a flicker, barely noticeable, but it grew, warm and soft, cutting through the darkness. Jacob's mind, frayed and overwhelmed, latched onto it. The light wasn't coming from the room, but from deep within his memory, something long buried, long ignored. It was a vision of his childhood, of the nights when his mother would tuck him into bed and whisper prayers over him. He could almost hear her voice now, soothing and calm, reciting the same prayer she had said every night, "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." For a moment, the darkness recoiled, pulling back as though repelled by the light. The figure at the foot of his bed wavered, its form flickering and fading as the memory of his mother's prayers filled the room. But it wasn't enough. The darkness surged forward again, stronger this time, as if enraged by the fleeting glimmer of hope. Jacob's body jerked violently, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The cold deepened, seeping into his bones, and the figure loomed closer, its hand outstretched once more. Jacob's mind raced. He had no idea what to do, no idea how to fight this. All he knew was that he couldn't escape. He was trapped, lost in the grip of something far beyond his understanding. Just as the figure's hand was about to touch him, the door to his room creaked open. A shaft of warm, yellow light spilled into the darkness, cutting through the cold like a beacon of safety. Standing in the doorway was Lucas, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. "Jacob." Lucas's voice was steady, but there was a note of concern. Jacob wanted to cry out, to beg his friend for help, but his voice was still trapped in his throat. Lucas stepped inside, the light from the hallway chasing away some of the shadows, though the dark figure at the foot of Jacob's bed remained. "Jacob, are you okay?" Lucas asked again, his voice firmer now, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer to his friend. Jacob couldn't respond. His body was still locked in place, the whispers still echoing in his mind. But Lucas could see the fear in his friend's eyes. He knew something was terribly wrong. Without hesitation, Lucas knelt beside Jacob's bed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm going to pray for you," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet conviction that Jacob had never understood. As Lucas began to pray, the dark figure recoiled, hissing like an animal cornered. The whispers faltered, and the cold began to recede. Jacob could feel the weight lifting, slowly but surely, as Lucas's voice filled the room with words of hope, faith, and authority. For the first time in what felt like hours, Jacob could breathe again. But the battle was far from over. The darkness had retreated, but it hadn't been defeated. Not yet. Part 3. The struggle for Jacob's soul. The dim light of dawn barely peeked through the blinds of Jacob's bedroom, casting long, faint shadows across the room. The air was still thick with the remnants of the night's terror, as if the darkness itself had left a stain on everything it touched. Jacob sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, his breathing shallow. His body was drenched in sweat, and though the morning light offered some relief from the horror of the previous hours, he felt far from safe. The events of the night replayed over and over in his mind. The whispers, the shadows, the figure that had seemed to crawl out of his nightmares and into reality. He could still feel the presence, lurking just beyond his sight, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike again. But now there was something else too. A small flame of hope flickered within him, fragile but present. And that hope had a name: Lucas. Lucas sat across from him, his Bible open on his lap, his brow furrowed in concentration. He had been praying for hours, his voice steady and calm, filled with a faith that Jacob had never understood. Lucas had always been the quiet, steadfast one. Growing up, they had been inseparable, but where Jacob had chosen rebellion, Lucas had chosen faith. Even in the midst of their very different paths, they had remained friends. But tonight, something had shifted between them. Lucas wasn't just a friend anymore. He was Jacob's lifeline. "How do you feel?" Lucas asked quietly, his voice soft but filled with concern. His eyes, though tired from the long night, remained sharp and full of purpose. Jacob lifted his head slowly, his hands trembling. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's like I'm still here, but I'm not. I'm scared, Lucas. I don't know what's happening to me." Lucas's gaze didn't waver. "I know this is hard to understand, but you're in the middle of a spiritual battle, Jacob. This isn't just about the drugs or the parties. It's something much deeper. There's darkness trying to take hold of you." Jacob's heart raced at the mention of darkness. He had felt it too. The figure, the whispers, it wasn't just in his mind. But why me? What did I do to deserve this? His voice cracked, the frustration and fear pouring out of him. He had always thought he was in control, that he could handle anything life threw at him. But now, he was completely helpless, trapped in a battle he didn't even know how to fight. Lucas closed his Bible and leaned forward, his expression serious but compassionate. It's not about what you've done. This isn't a punishment. It's more like, you open a door, Jacob. The things you've been doing, the choices you've made, they've left you vulnerable. But that doesn't mean it's too late. Jacob scoffed, though there was no real conviction behind it. You think some prayers can fix this? You saw what happened last night, Lucas. This isn't something that just goes away. Lucas leaned back, his expression unwavering. I'm not saying it will be easy. This isn't just a quick fix. But I believe in the power of God, Jacob. I've seen miracles happen, and I believe one can happen for you too. But you have to want it? Jacob was silent for a long moment, staring at the floor. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. A part of him still wanted to reject everything Lucas was saying, to hold on to the idea that he could somehow fix this on his own. But the events of the last few weeks, no, the last few hours, had shattered that illusion. He wasn't in control. He never had been. Finally, he looked up at Lucas, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. What do I have to do? Lucas's face softened, a small, hopeful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You have to let go, Jacob. Let go of the anger, the rebellion, the things you've been holding on to for so long. You need to let God in. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For Jacob, they felt like an impossible task. He had spent years building up walls, keeping God and everyone else at a distance. The thought of letting those walls down, of surrendering, terrified him. But what terrified him more was the alternative. If he didn't do this, if he didn't try, he knew the darkness would win. Jacob took a deep breath, his body shaking. Okay, he whispered. Okay, I'll try. Lucas smiled again, this time with a deep sense of relief. That's all God needs. Just that one step. Lucas stood and moved to kneel beside Jacob's bed, motioning for Jacob to join him. Reluctantly, Jacob slid off the edge of the bed and knelt beside his friend. The floor was cold against his knees, and his heart pounded in his chest. He had never prayed like this before. Sure, he had been forced to say grace at the dinner table growing up, and he had mumbled half-hearted prayers at church to please his parents. But this was different. This felt real. Lucas began to pray, his voice low but powerful. He prayed for protection, for peace, for deliverance. Jacob closed his eyes, listening to the words but not fully understanding them. He wasn't sure if he believed in all this, if he even believed in God at all. But there was something in Lucas's voice, in the way he spoke with such certainty, that gave Jacob a small measure of comfort. As Lucas prayed, the room grew quiet, eerily quiet. The whispers that had plagued Jacob all night were gone, replaced by an overwhelming stillness. The air, once cold and heavy, felt lighter, almost peaceful. Jacob's heart rate slowed, his body relaxing for the first time in days. But just as he began to let his guard down, the room shifted. A sudden, sharp chill swept through the room, so cold it felt like ice water had been dumped over Jacob's skin. His eyes snapped open, and his breath hitched in his throat. The shadows, which had seemed to retreat in the presence of Lucas's prayer, began to thicken again, swirling around the edges of the room like smoke. The darkness was returning, stronger than before. Jacob's body went rigid, fear seizing him as the shadows took shape once more, coalescing into the same figure that had haunted him in the night. It stood at the foot of his bed, taller now, more defined. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, glowed with a sickly, malevolent light, and its form seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The temperature in the room plummeted, and Jacob's breath came out in short, panicked gasps, visible in the freezing air. Lucas, sensing the change, didn't stop praying. His voice grew louder, more forceful, as he commanded the darkness to leave. But the figure didn't move. It stood there unmoving, its gaze fixed on Jacob, as if daring him to act. For a moment, Jacob was paralyzed by fear. His mind raced and his body trembled. The whispers returned, louder and more aggressive than ever before, filling his head with cruel, hateful words. "You're weak. You're nothing. You'll never be free." Jacob squeezed his eyes shut, his hands clenching into fists. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let the darkness win. But he didn't know how to fight it. He didn't know if he had the strength. And then, in the midst of the chaos, he heard something, a voice, quiet but clear, cutting through the noise in his mind. "Call out to me." Jacob's eyes flew open. The voice wasn't one of the whispers. It was something else, something pure. He didn't understand it, but deep down, he knew it was real. It was a lifeline, a rope thrown to him in the middle of a storm. Without thinking, Jacob did something he had never done before. He opened his mouth, and with a trembling voice, he whispered, "God, help me." The moment the words left his lips, the air in the room shifted. The shadows recoiled as if struck, the figure at the foot of the bed faltering, its form flickering and distorting. The cold began to lift, replaced by a warmth that started deep in Jacob's chest and spread outward. Lucas, his voice still strong, continued to pray, but now Jacob joined him, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "Help me," he whispered again, louder this time. "God, help me." The figure hissed, its form unraveling as the darkness around it began to dissipate. The whispers, once so loud, faded into nothingness, and the room was filled with a sense of peace that Jacob had never known before. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the darkness was gone. Jacob collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt free. The weight that had pressed down on him for so long was gone. The chains had been broken. Lucas placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, his eyes filled with both relief and quiet joy. "It's over," he said softly. "You're not alone anymore." Jacob nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He didn't understand everything that had just happened, but he knew one thing for sure. Something had changed. Something inside him had shifted, and the darkness no longer held power over him. For the first time in his life, Jacob felt like he could breathe again. But he also knew that this was only the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war for his soul was far from over. Part 4. A Reckoning at Dawn. The early morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains of the living room, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. The quiet hum of the heater filled the silence, but there was a tension in the air that made the house feel on edge, as if it were holding its breath. Jacob sat on the worn leather couch, his head resting against the back, eyes closed, as if trying to steady himself in the aftermath of the battle that had just unfolded upstairs in his bedroom. He hadn't slept. His body was heavy with exhaustion, but his mind raced, still processing what had happened. The darkness that had haunted him for weeks had lifted, yet it left behind an overwhelming emptiness, a hollow pit where fear and confusion had once resided. Now, in the silence of the morning, Jacob found himself grappling with something he had spent years avoiding: the weight of his choices. Across the room, Lucas stood near the fireplace, his arms crossed, watching Jacob with a mix of concern and quiet determination. The morning's events had taken their toll on him, too. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had fought a battle of faith all night. But he wasn't shaken. In fact, Lucas seemed more focused than ever, as though the struggle they had faced together had only strengthened his resolve. "I still don't get it," Jacob murmured, his voice hoarse from the prayers and the emotional strain. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the soft light as he glanced over at Lucas. "Why now? Why did it take all of this to get here?" Lucas remained silent for a moment, his gaze steady as he studied his friend. He knew that Jacob's question wasn't just about the night's events. It was about everything: his life, his rebellion, the years of running from faith, from God, from anything that felt like authority. Jacob had spent years building walls, and now, in the quiet of the morning, those walls had finally started to crack. "Sometimes it takes hitting rock bottom to realize how much you need help," Lucas said gently, walking across the room to sit beside Jacob on the couch. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind his words that Jacob couldn't ignore. "I don't think you're being punished for anything. But I do think that what you've been going through is more than just a bad phase. It's a wake-up call." Jacob let out a sharp breath, running his hands through his tousled hair. "A wake-up call," he repeated bitterly. "I almost lost my mind, Lucas. That thing, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. I felt it. It wanted to." He trailed off, his voice trembling, unable to finish the thought. Lucas nodded, understanding the fear that lingered beneath Jacob's words. "I know," he said quietly. "I felt it too. Whatever it was, it's not just in your imagination. It was real, Jacob. But you need to understand that it wasn't just after your mind. It was after your soul." Jacob's stomach churned at the thought, his chest tightening as the full weight of Lucas's words sank in. He had never considered the state of his soul before. He had always dismissed the idea of good and evil, of heaven and hell, as things his parents used to scare him into obedience. But now, after everything he had experienced, he wasn't so sure. "Do you really believe that?" Jacob asked, his voice quieter now, almost vulnerable. "That all of this is part of some spiritual war? That I've been a target?" Lucas turned toward him, his expression softening. "I believe it because I've seen it. What you've been going through, Jacob, it's not just coincidence. The choices we make, the things we invite into our lives, they have consequences. You might not have believed in it, but the spiritual world is very real." Jacob's eyes dropped to the floor, his hands fidgeting in his lap. He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. His life had been so chaotic for so long that the idea of something as intangible as a spiritual war felt overwhelming. Yet everything in the last few weeks, the shadows, the voices, the figure in his room, it all pointed to something far beyond what he could explain away. "I don't know what to do," Jacob admitted after a long pause, his voice breaking. He had never felt so lost, so completely out of control of his own life. The fear that had consumed him for weeks was fading, but in its place was an emptiness that terrified him even more. "I don't even know where to start." Lucas placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, his touch firm but reassuring. "You've already started," he said. "The fact that you called out to God, that's the first step. It's not about fixing everything at once. It's about taking it one day at a time, letting go of the things that are holding you back, and trusting that God can and will help you heal." Jacob sat in silence, letting Lucas's words sink in. One day at a time. The idea sounded so simple, but after everything he had been through, it felt impossible. How could he just let go of the years of rebellion, of anger, of all the things that had defined him for so long? Could he even change? "I don't know if I can do it," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can be the person my parents wanted me to be. The person you are?" Lucas smiled faintly, shaking his head. "I'm not asking you to be me, Jacob. And God isn't asking you to be perfect. He's just asking you to come as you are, to be honest with him about your fears, your doubts, your mistakes. The rest, that's what grace is for." The word grace hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was a word Jacob had heard 1,000 times in church growing up, but had never truly understood. Now, in the aftermath of everything, it seemed to take on a new significance, something he desperately needed but didn't know how to accept. Jacob leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his head in his hands once again. The exhaustion weighed down on him, both physically and emotionally. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt the faintest flicker of hope. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe it wasn't too late for him. "I don't know how to do this," Jacob muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know how to pray." Lucas's smile grew a little wider, though it was still soft, understanding. "You don't need fancy words. Just talk to God like you would talk to a friend. Tell him what's on your heart." Jacob hesitated, the idea feeling foreign and strange. But then he remembered the darkness, the way it had wrapped around him, suffocating him, and the way it had lifted when Lucas had prayed. If there was even the smallest chance that this God Lucas spoke of was real, Jacob knew he had to try. With a deep breath, Jacob closed his eyes. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft crackling of the fireplace in the corner. The warmth from the flames seemed to settle over him, a comforting contrast to the cold he had felt in his soul for so long. "God," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know if you're there. But if you are, I need help. I'm scared, and I don't know what to do. I don't want to live like this anymore, but I don't know how to change. If you can hear me, help me." The words were simple, almost hesitant, but they were the most honest words Jacob had spoken in years. For a moment, the room remained still, as if nothing had changed. But deep inside, Jacob felt something shift, a small, quiet peace settling in the space where chaos had once reigned. He opened his eyes slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He looked over at Lucas, who was watching him with quiet pride. "You did it," Lucas said softly. "That's all it takes, just that willingness to ask for help." Jacob nodded, still unsure of what had just happened, but feeling lighter nonetheless. The weight wasn't completely gone, but it was bearable now. He had taken the first step, and somehow, he knew that things were going to be different. Not perfect, not easy, but different. For the first time in his life, Jacob didn't feel alone. As the morning sun continued to rise outside, casting a golden light over the quiet streets of Oslo, Jacob knew that his journey was just beginning. The darkness had been pushed back, but there was still a long road ahead. He didn't know what that road would look like or where it would lead, but with Lucas by his side and a newfound faith beginning to take root, he was ready to face whatever came next. In the stillness of the living room, with the warmth of the fire crackling softly in the background, Jacob found a moment of peace. A peace he hadn't felt in years. And for the first time, he dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was freedom on the other side of this battle. Part 5. Embracing the light. The late morning sunlight streamed through the wide kitchen windows, illuminating every corner of the room. The warmth of the sun created a stark contrast to the coldness Jacob had lived with for so long. The soft clatter of dishes and the comforting smell of fresh coffee brewing filled the air, but Jacob's mind was far from the mundane normalcy of breakfast. He sat at the wooden kitchen table, his hands loosely wrapped around a cup of coffee, though he hadn't taken a single sip. Across from him sat his parents, Marcus and Ingrid, their expressions a mix of exhaustion, concern, and cautious hope. The events of the night before hung heavily between them. Jacob could feel the weight of his parents' unspoken questions, the fear and relief etched into their tired faces. They had heard the commotion in the night, the muffled sounds of struggle and Lucas's fervent prayers. They knew something had happened, something they couldn't explain, but they hadn't yet asked the questions they were clearly holding back. Marcus, usually a pillar of quiet strength, looked fragile now. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, the dark circles under his eyes evidence of sleepless nights spent worrying about his son. Ingrid, sitting beside him, reached out to place a comforting hand on his arm, her eyes never leaving Jacob's face. She had been waiting for this moment for what felt like years. Jacob shifted in his seat, the silence pressing in around them. He knew that his parents deserved answers, but he wasn't sure how to begin. How did he explain the darkness that had nearly consumed him? How did he tell them about the figure that had loomed over him in the dead of night, or the way he had felt his soul being pulled apart? Even now, it all felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare he couldn't shake. But it had been real, terrifyingly, undeniably real. "I know I haven't been myself," Jacob began slowly, his voice quiet but steady. His eyes flicked between his parents, taking in their worried expressions. "For a long time, I've been lost. I didn't want to hear anything about God or faith or any of the things you've always believed in. I thought I could do everything on my own, but I was wrong." Ingrid's hand tightened on Marcus's arm, her breath catching in her throat as she listened to her son's words. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his eyes full of questions, but giving Jacob the space to continue. "There's been something dark following me," Jacob continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's like I opened a door I didn't even know was there. And once it was open, I couldn't close it. The things I've been doing, the drugs, the partying, I thought it was just me trying to live my life, trying to escape all the pressure. But it wasn't just me." The room was still as his words hung in the air. Jacob could see the pain in his parents' eyes as they absorbed what he was saying, the realization of just how far he had fallen sinking in. He had never wanted to hurt them, but his choices had driven a wedge between them that felt impossible to bridge. I didn't know how to stop it, Jacob continued, his voice shaking slightly. But last night something happened. Lucas came, and he prayed for me. And he paused, struggling to find the right words. I don't know if I fully understand it yet, but I think God heard me. I called out to him, and I felt something change. The darkness, it's gone. It's like a weight has been lifted off me. Ingrid's eyes filled with tears, and she let out a soft sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Marcus reached over and gently squeezed her hand, his own eyes misting over as he looked at his son. The son they had prayed for so many nights, fearing they had lost him forever. Jacob swallowed hard, feeling the emotion well up inside him as he saw the relief on his parents' faces. For the first time in years, they looked at him not with disappointment or fear, but with hope. He had spent so long running from their faith, from their love, but now he was ready to come home. I'm sorry, Jacob whispered, his voice breaking as he finally said the words that had been sitting heavy on his heart for so long. For everything, for the lies, for the way I've treated you, for the nights I stayed out, the trouble I caused. I'm so sorry. Ingrid couldn't hold back any longer. She stood up from the table and rushed to her son, pulling him into a tight embrace. Jacob stiffened at first, unaccustomed to the physical closeness, but then he relaxed, his arms wrapping around his mother as he let out a deep, shuddering breath. He hadn't realized just how much he needed this, how much he had missed the simple warmth of his mother's embrace, the comfort of knowing he wasn't alone. Marcus stood as well, moving to place a hand on his son's shoulder. The gesture was small, but it carried with it the weight of years of silent love, of a father who had watched his son drift further and further away, but had never stopped hoping for his return. We never gave up on you, Jacob, Marcus said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. We prayed every day. We always believed that God would bring you back. Jacob pulled away slightly, looking between his parents with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. I don't deserve this, he said, his voice trembling. After everything I've done, Ingrid shook her head, brushing a tear from her cheek as she cupped Jacob's face in her hands. None of us deserve grace, Jacob. That's the beauty of it. It's a gift, and God's grace is enough for you, just like it's enough for all of us. The words hit Jacob with a force he hadn't expected. Grace. It was a concept he had spent his whole life resisting, dismissing as a crutch for people who couldn't handle the weight of the world on their own. But now, sitting here in the warmth of his family's kitchen, surrounded by the love he had tried so hard to push away, Jacob realized that grace was the very thing he had been searching for all along. He had been running from the very thing that could set him free. I want to be different, Jacob said softly, his voice filled with a new determination. I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want to run anymore. Lucas, who had been standing quietly by the doorway, watching the scene unfold, stepped forward now, his face lit with a quiet smile. You don't have to go back, he said gently. This is a new beginning, Jacob. You've taken the first step. The rest will come, one day at a time. Jacob nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude for Lucas, for his parents, and for the grace he had found in the most unexpected of places. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't running. He was finally ready to face whatever came next. The kitchen was filled with a sense of peace, the kind of peace that only comes after a long, hard-fought battle. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer held the power to crush him. He wasn't defined by his mistakes, his rebellion, or the darkness that had once consumed him. He was free to rebuild, free to embrace the life he had once thought was beyond his reach. As the morning light continued to brighten the room, Jacob knew that this was more than just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new story, one filled with hope, with redemption, and with a faith he was only just beginning to understand. And for the first time, Jacob believed that he had a future worth fighting for. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.